Greetings once again from that Gnostic teacher on the internet. I begin, as always, with a challenge. I want you to know that the challenge goes both ways. It's a two-way street. I know that it can be a challenge to listen to me and to bring determination and patience to hear what I have to say. But I would like you to know that it's also a challenge for me each time to select from all that I might say something that will really matter to you, something that will be worth your time and reward your attention. Remember, may your attention be rewarded by the truth. So I do reflect on that a lot. And as we're living in such a critical moment in the entire history of the human species, I reflect on it more than ever. So however you may regard me, I invite you to bear that in mind, that I do face that challenge each time I decide to speak. So what can I say now? Well, how about this? How about I tell you about my greatest discovery in comparative mythology? Now, my career in comparative mythology has occupied all of my life since I was about 9 or 10 years old. First instance that I recall that caught my interest in mythology was a children's picture book that I discovered in the 4th grade in the schoolroom in Friendship, Maine. It was a description of the fantastic finds in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And I went on from there into high school. In the first year, I took Latin. And the Latin teacher, Mrs. Kimball, also provided us each week, I think it was on Fridays, with some studies in Greek and Latin mythology. So by that time, in my early teens, I was hooked. And through my life, I progressed and developed more and more interest in the field of comparative mythology, which is quite a specialized field. I venture to say that, well, you may have heard of Joseph Campbell or Mircea Eliade, two well-known names. Those individuals both died in the 1980s. And I venture to say that I may be the only comparative mythologist in the world today. It's possible. In any case, it took me about 50 years to make this discovery that I will now describe to you. And of course, there were many other discoveries along the way, many things that I learned in that rich genre of mythology. But this one, without question, tops them all. And I'm really confident that this discovery has a value that transcends and surpasses my own particular and individual path of investigation. So, I'll tell you right off what the discovery is. Recently, I read a comment from a student who said that, well, Lash takes ages to get to the point. All right, I agree with him. That is, in fact, often the case. So what I'm going to do in this talk, already in the 5th minute, is I'm going to give you the takeaway. I'm going to tell you what I discovered. And then if you find that worth your interest, I'll go on and explain at not too much length how I discovered it. So what I discovered was that the entire field of world mythology of all cultures and all times only contains two myths that describe the origin of humanity. Only two. Now, that might not seem remarkable. I don't know how that sounds to you, but I'm sure that there are some people who have delved into mythology via C.G. Jung or however, who might find that to be a rather surprising statement. After all, there is a category within the vast array of myths of the world known as origin myths or creation myths. And one might assume that these origin myths, which are found in hundreds of different cultures, describe the origin of the human species, how humanity came to exist, or how we were created, or however you want to put it. But as a matter of fact, on close examination, that is not the case. The reality is that, let's say I'm going to highlight 30 different myths, 30 different cultures, which contain, let's say, the most abundant material on origins of the human species, origin of the earth itself. As a matter of fact, that the material that is distributed through these myths of different cultures and races is not uniform at all. Some of the material, that's, of course, I'm talking about surviving material, and much of it survives from oral renditions of myth that were written down very, very late. But among all that surviving material, the information that you find about human origins varies greatly. Some myths contain clear scenarios of human origin, others are very sketchy. So let's say that out of the hundreds of myths that could be chosen from the different races of the world, let's say we'll set aside 30 of them as having the best possible offering, the best possible evidence for a narrative of human origins. And if you select out those 30 and look at them closely, you will find that there are only two that actually describe or purport to describe the origin of the human species, of humanity as a whole. That's my greatest discovery. So, if I have your interest on that point, you will certainly wonder, well, what is so significant about that fact? What does it say? What difference does it make? How would it matter today to anyone who is facing what we are facing in the world today? Well, it matters profoundly, I can assure you. And in order to get that across to you, I'd like to tell you about how I discovered this. Because if I take you through a journey with me, the journey of discovery, of investigation and discovery, then I believe that is a good way to frame it for you and to situate you so that you can then appreciate the paramount importance of this fact, that there are only two bodies of myth in the world that describe the origin of the human species. So how did I discover that? Well, I'm going to change the language and I'm going to go from the first person to the second person. And I'm going to speak now of you and what you did to discover that. So let's say that you undertook at a certain early age an investigation of all the myths of the world. That's what makes you a comparative mythologist. You look at the Japanese, the Siberian, the Polynesian, the variations of the American Indians. You look at the classical Greek and Latin mythology. You look at the Iranian. You compare it with the Hindu or Indian. And you lay out all that material, that vast body of material. And in order to make the investigation concrete for you, let's picture a vast studio, like a warehouse. You would need a warehouse, really. And let's say that you have in this warehouse set out 30 tables. And upon those 30 tables, you have accumulated and compiled the best materials, because there are some racial mythologies that only contain extremely sketchy or scanty material on human origins. So you sort of put those aside in the corner in the back room, and you just select out the 30 best examples of mythologies that would describe, explain, or present a narrative about how human beings originated. Okay? So you're in this vast warehouse, and there are these 30 tables. And each of these tables has material on it. It has, say, texts, images, maybe even little statues and icons that come from these mythological complexes. For instance, there is the table of Egyptian mythology. And obviously, you have texts, hieroglyphic texts. You have images of the various gods and goddesses. You may have a statue of Isis. You have the material found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And you have quite a large enriched table of Egyptian mythology. Then you turn over there and you have, let's say, Iranian mythology. And then another table, Aztec. And on the table of Aztec mythology, you have the codices from the Aztecs. You have certain statuettes of Aztec goddesses, such as Xochiquetzal. You have a model of the Aztec calendar stone, and you have not only, in addition to the so-called primary sources, but you have other books of secondary sources of scholars who have investigated this material and commented on its meaning. So these are tables full of material that takes years to accumulate and even more years to evaluate. So put yourself in that situation, in that warehouse with those 30 tables. So once you've acquired all this material, you wander among the tables, you stand there and you look at the vast body of evidence of these myths, and gradually, over a period of time, something becomes obvious to you. You realize that the table of Aztec mythology, for instance, contains all kinds of myths, legends, images, themes, stories, anecdotes. It's like a collection of movie scripts, or a collection of just clips from a movie, clips from various movies, or in some cases, more detailed movie scripts. And you're looking at these scripts and these narratives, and you conclude over a period of time that they are extremely diverse and they tell a lot of different stories. And as you consider all of these stories, you realize that not all of the narratives on any particular table are about origins. So, for instance, let's wander over to the table of Greek mythology. Well, there's a vast body of Greek mythology, all the gods and goddesses whose names are commonly known to some people. And you look at them all, and there are tales of Hermes, of Aphrodite, of Juno, and of Zeus, of all of the dozens of deities and supernatural figures in Greek mythology. And as you're looking over the collection, you realize, well, you come to ask yourself, actually, it's a question that emerges in the course of investigation. You ask yourself, well, hold on a minute. There are all kinds of stories and themes and motifs and symbolic images and archetypes on this table of Greek mythology, but where on this table do I find that particular material that can be called an origin myth? It's also called the first peoples myth. So where among the vast collection of Greek myths are those particular myths that describe the origin of the Greek people? I'm looking for the origin myth. And as you contemplate that question, another question comes to mind. And that is, how do the people represented by this body of myth identify themselves? And how do they see their origins? How do they explain their origins, where they came from? And how do they identify why they're here? Because aren't those the two questions that come together in an origin myth? How did we get here? And why are we here? So the how and the why go together. So over a number of years, as you learn to become more sophisticated in handling this material, it's an enormous body of evidence, you eventually form, after about, for me it took about 50 years to form this concept. You form the concept of a mythogen. Now a mythogen is like a pathogen. It's something that's alive. It's something that has a quasi-biological activity. And just like a pathogen can infect, the mythogen is also infectious. So you could say that the Aztec people were infected with their mythogen. And by mythogen, what you come to understand is those particular elements in the entire collection of mythology that describe the how and the why. You see, you could spend years reading Aztec mythology without actually identifying the specific myths of the Aztecs that describe how they originated and why they exist. What is their purpose, origin and purpose? So the mythogen is that particular specific and limited component of mythology that describes those two factors. So now you have a very powerful tool of investigation. Now you can wander among the 30 tables. You can look down, for instance, at the table of Chinese mythology, which is vast, very, very many images, quasi-mythological characters like Fu He, who is this sort of shamanic, shaggy man of the wilds who is said to have discovered the I Ching in the form of 8 markings on the back of a turtle, and other quasi-historical legendary figures in Chinese mythology, such as the Yellow Emperor. And so you're looking at this vast body of Chinese myths, and you're no longer merely distracted and entertained by delving into it here and there in a haphazard way, are you? No, now you have a focus. Now you have a powerful tool. You have a question, unlike any other question. So you lean over the table of Chinese mythology and you ask yourself, well, where do I find the mythogen of the Chinese people. That specific myth that describes how they originated and what is the purpose of their being here. You can go to every one of the 30 tables and you can ask the same question. Now you're really on to something, because now you have a tool of selection of paramount value, the mythogen. So, for instance, I won't obviously go into many examples because the genre of comparative mythology is extremely elaborate and discursive, and it would take me an hour to cover adequately, say, the mythogens of 5 different tables. Okay? Let's just say we wander again over to the Aztec table, and we say, okay, there's dozens of myths, fragments of myths. Here are codices. Here are astronomical tables of Venus in the Dresden Codex. Here's all this immensely rich material on the jaguar cults, on the eagle cults, on the flower wars. Absolutely fascinating. But hold on. Apply the tool. Where is the mythogen of the Aztec peoples? Well, you find that the mythogen of the Aztec peoples is very, very striking. It's an amazing story, but it's very obscure. The Aztecs cannot actually explain where they originated. They said that they came from a mysterious land called Aztlan, and it was lost or disappeared in the mists, and then they found themselves wandering, and after many years of wandering, they ended up in the valley of Mexico, and they saw an eagle land on a copal tree, and the eagle had a serpent in its mouth. And when they saw that, they realized that it was a sign of their destiny, their mission, their purpose, which was to settle in the Valley of Mexico and conquer the valley, conquer the indigenous people that were there, and establish a mighty warrior, shamanic warrior empire, which is what they did. So that's the mythogen of the Aztecs. Now when you go, for instance, I'll just do one more. Look at the mythogen of the Roman people. Now the Romans were another race, another ethnic group who established a tremendous empire, one of the greatest empires in human history. So how do the Romans explain their origin? Well, they had a kind of a dual explanation. On the one hand, they said that there was a hero of the Trojan War named Aeneas, and that he fled from Troy when the city fell, very famous story recorded in the Iliad of Homer. He actually ran from the city with his father Anchises on his back, and he then ventured and wandered through the Mediterranean and eventually came to Latium, Latium, which is the land of the Etruscans. And there in the land of the Etruscans, who have their own mythogen and their own story of origin, established the beginning of the Roman Empire, the Roman people. And the secondary story that goes along, that fits into their mythogen, is the story of Romulus and Remus, who were 2 young boys abandoned in the wilderness, and they were raised by a wolf. And they were in competition as the founders of the city of Rome, which is said to have been founded in 747 BC. So there you go. There's the origin myth of the Romans. And the purpose that is sometimes stated openly, but more or less implied, not clearly and openly stated. The purpose of the Roman people was to establish a great empire. And that is often the purpose of many of the examples you find. For instance, in the Chinese mythogen, there's the expression, the mandate of heaven. So the Chinese people, however they may have originated, and I forget the details at this moment, believed that their society, their civilization, was founded upon the mandate of heaven, Shang-Ti, which is to say that they had from a divine creator God a mandate and a mission, which was to establish the Chinese civilization. You see? So those are some examples. So just imagine that you walk around the warehouse and you examine every one of these 30 tables, and then you step back and you make a summary of your findings. You summarize in a file the mythogens of 30 different racial cultures. And then you look at that and you study that, and something about that list comes to your attention. It's something that you could only know if you went through this process and if you developed this vast perspective, because it's only by comparative scrutiny could you arrive at what you're going to discover now. You discover that of all those 30, only two myths, only two mythogens of two specific origins claim to describe the origin of the entire human species. Now, how is that so? Well, you have to use terminology, specialist terminology, which you yourself develop in the process of this investigation. And the key terminology here is race-specific. So what you notice in making this overview is that the Aztec mythogen, the Iranian mythogen, the Japanese mythogen, the Greek mythogen, the Egyptian mythogen, and so on, all describe a race-specific origin. Their origin story is race-specific. So the Egyptian myth describes the origin of the Egyptian people, going back to the legend of the followers of Horus. The Japanese myth describes the origin of the Japanese people uniquely. The Aztec myth that I just briefly recounted, the mythogen, describes the origin only of the Aztec people. Likewise, for all the myths of the Native American peoples, be they the Navajo, the Hopi, the Apache, hundreds of Indian tribes, their origin myths are all race-specific. So when you've made this inventory and you're standing back, taking in the great overview, after many years of scrutinizing this material in detail, you come away with really an astonishing discovery. That of all those myths, there are only two origin myths that are not race-specific. Do you see that? They are not race-specific. They are generic to humanity as a whole. So there is one table over there, and there is another table over there. I won't put the labels on them right now. And in the material on those tables, you find origin myths that describe the origin of humanity as a whole. They are not race-specific. They are race-specific to the extent that they come from a specific race and culture, but they are not race-specific in the content of the origin myth. So that's the greatest discovery that can be made in comparative mythology, and that's how you made it. That's how I made it. So, how to conclude? Well, obviously, I'm going to make it somewhat of a cliffhanger because I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to label those two tables. But let me propose this to you. We put aside and push aside to the walls all the other 28 tables. And we pull forward these two tables and we set them side by side. And we start to investigate them more in depth, knowing, due to having that tool of the mythogen, knowing that they both describe the origin and purpose of humanity in a generic sense. In a generic sense. They are myths that claim to go back to the origin of the human species in its entirety. Therefore, they are not race specific, even though they come, interestingly, from two specific races. Well, they have to, because let me tell you the hard and brutal truth of it all. Mythology is racist. And if you are a comparative mythologist, then you are most definitely a racist, because it is a very great fact that each and every myth or body of myths produced by human imagination comes specifically from a particular race. Hence, the 14-volume compilation of resource material, The Mythology of All Races. So, playing on that theme, on the racist theme, I want to leave you with this intriguing thought. If there are only two mythogens in the entire collection of world mythology that are generic, then isn't it interesting to contemplate that there could have been two races who did not produce a race-specific mythology? That's outstanding. That is something that deserves your highest attention. Because what are we looking for in mythology? What are we looking for in religion, in metaphysics? Well, we're looking for an explanation of how humanity originated and what is the purpose of being here. But the Aztec myth doesn't tell you that. Polynesian myth, Iranian, Siberian. None of these myths tell you about the origin of the entire species. They only tell you about the origin of their peoples. So there you have it. That's the greatest discovery. And I'll leave you with that, as I say, intentionally. It's a cliffhanger. So, if it's worth your time, I'll devote a follow-up talk to tell you specifically the origin of these two unique mythogens. And I'll identify where they originated, and it will become obvious as I do so that something of crucial significance about the human situation today and the problem in the world today is illuminated by knowing about these two mythogens. It's not just a matter of scholarly interest that they happen to be exceptional and outstanding, but as a matter of fact, the more you look at them, the more you compare them and contrast them, the more obvious it becomes how they tell us where it's at. And they tell us and show us what's wrong in the world today, and they also show the solution. But I'll let you decide for yourself if that is the case. So I invite your interest. Hang on, and we'll see where this tale leads from here.